Hey, what's up everybody? It's Chris Sims here from ComicsAlliance.com, and this is Here's the Thing. For today's episode, we're going to talk about the books you should read second. And by that, I mean the stuff you should be looking for if you're a new reader, once you've read all the stuff that's on all those lists of comics that are great for new readers. See, comics are actually really good at giving readers good jumping on points. There's nothing superhero publishers love more than putting out a book with a giant #1 on the cover to drum up reader interest. And ever since graphic novels started breaking into the bookstore market back in the 80s, they've gone out of their way to provide people with self-contained stories in a single volume, all in the name of bringing in new readers. And that's great, and it works. Books like Watchmen, books like The Dark Knight Returns, Walking Dead. When I was working in a shop, we couldn't keep Walking Dead Volume 1 in stock, and we were in a market that was very superhero heavy. People like to be able to jump on new stuff when they get curious about it. But here's the thing. As great as comics are about making jumping on points, they're not actually that great at letting readers know where to go next. You'd think they would be, because after all, they've been doing long-form sequential storytelling that builds on itself and contradicts itself for the past 75 years. But they're kind of not. For every Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen that goes out to the bookstore market that gets picked up by a new reader, that's also a jumping-off point. They don't lead anywhere. There are other books by Alan Moore, other books by Dave Gibbons, other books by Frank Miller, but a lot of the times they exist in these isolated little boxes. So if you want to get more into these big superhero universes, you're kind of out of luck, unless you know where to go next. Now, if you've got a local store that you're shopping at, then the easiest way to do this is just to talk to someone who works there. Because people who work at comic book stores tend to read a lot of comics. And if you can tell them a few things you like or that you're interested in, you can generally get a pretty good recommendation on where to go from there. But if you don't have that local store, what if you're buying graphic novels off Amazon? What if you're getting your comics digitally from Comixology at 3 a.m. in your bed, like I do? Then you don't have that connection. You don't have a person that you can talk to. You've got lists of great comics for new readers, but once you burn through those, what do? Well, that's what we're here for today. My pal Benito Sereno has done a series of really great posts on his Tumblr, which is benito-sereno.tumblr.com, called For the Uninitiated. And they're really great. They're for new readers who want to find out more about a particular character like Batman or Superman. They're well worth checking out if you're a new reader, and even if you're not. But I prefer a different approach. See, superhero universes are so big and interconnected that once you know what you're looking for, and once you know how to look for it, you don't have to stay restricted to just a particular character, or even a particular company, even a particular group of creators. So, today I thought it might be fun to take two well-known starting points that are often given to new readers, one classic, one modern, and see if I can make a few connections that'll get us to some slightly deeper cuts. Before we go any further, I want to specify that I'm just going to be talking about superhero comics in this one. I know that independent creator-owned books are often far more in need of word of mouth from people like me. Believe me, I know. But superheroes are kind of my area of expertise, and at the same time, superheroes are also where a lot of people are connecting to comics through the movies. Now, moviegoers don't often go to comics, and that's fine, even if they want to enjoy an inferior medium like cinema. But if people do see those movies and want to find out more about the comics universes those characters come from, then it's nice to have a resource for them. So if you're already a diehard comics fan, then there's a really good chance you're going to be familiar with everything I'm going to talk about in this episode. If you're not, then you might get some good recommendations for stuff that you're interested in. So let's go ahead and start. So the first book we're going to be talking about is the jumping on point that's probably been given to more new readers than anything else in comics history. Batman Year One. My favorite comic of all time. I love this book. And it's great for new readers because it's an origin story. It's one of the foundations of modern comics that still gets referenced even 30 years later. For a long time, it was the only DC origin that had stayed in continuity, pretty much inviolate, until Zero Year came out. Zero Year is also pretty good, but it's not over yet, so we'll talk about that at a future date. Also, it's got the #1 right there in the title, so you know exactly what you're doing when you're getting into it. But where do you go when it's over? Now, there's two obvious answers to that question, and I don't really go with either of them. The first is that you go from Year One to Dark Knight Returns. Now, I love Dark Knight Returns, probably my second favorite comic book story of all time. But at the same time, I don't actually think it makes a good thing to read after Year One. See, Dark Knight Returns comes first. Dark Knight Returns is the end of Silver Age Batman. This is the beginning of Modern Age Batman, or, 1986 to 2012 Batman. So, Dark Knight Returns loses a lot of impact because this had so much impact on the Batman that came after. If you read Dark Knight Returns as the end of this version of Batman, everything just kind of makes sense. Everything is a logical progression, and that's not what Dark Knight Returns is about. Dark Knight Returns is about Adam West Batman coming back. Everything that happens in that book is shocking because it's Silver Age Batman doing it. Silver Age Batman retires and Gotham turns into this horrible urban hellhole, and he ends up having to fight mutants in a mud pit, whereas he would have been fighting, I don't know, Egghead in a museum. That's what makes Dark Knight Returns great. So you should definitely read it, don't get me wrong, but if you want to know the place to go to get a whole picture of Batman, I would say that's not the beginning and end that a lot of people like to call it. But I'm getting sidetracked. That's a whole other thing. So the other obvious choice on where to go with Batman Year 1 is to go to Batman Year 2. It's got the word 2 right there in the title, right? Don't do that. Guys, I love Batman Year 2. I've written about it before. I've talked to Mike W. Barr about it, and it's genuinely a great story. It's also completely bonkers. This is a story that has beautiful Alan Davis art. It's got beautiful Todd McFarlane art before he went to Marvel and started doing Spider-Man and became the hottest thing in the world for a few years. It's also the story where Batman has the gun that killed his parents, and he pulls it out to use it to kill the guy who killed his parents that he has to team up with to stop another criminal who is a vigilante that existed in Gotham City before Batman. So it's a little complicated. Fortunately, Batman Year 1 was so popular that it actually inspired a whole subgenre of Batman comics, including Batman and the Monster Men and Batman and the Mad Monk by Matt Wagner. These are great stories, and they're great not just because of themselves, but because of what they actually are. See, these are set in the Year 1 timeline, which contains a lot of different stories. Long Halloween is in there, Dark Victory is in there, most Legends of the Dark Knight stories are set in Year 1, which makes it the busiest year that has ever happened. But these are actually retellings of classic Batman stories from Batman's actual first year, 1939 and 1940, in Detective Comics. The Mad Monk was a very early villain. The Monster Men and Hugo Strange were very early villains for Batman. So getting a modern take on that is actually really cool. And they're great stories. They're great sequels to Year 1 in the way that a lot of things are. So I would say definitely check these out after Year 1. Now, where do you go from there? Well, if you want more Year 1 stories, they're out there. You can get Batman Ego by Darwin Cook that is usually in the same book as Selina's Big Score, which could lead you to the Catwoman reboot by Ed Brubaker and Darwin Cook, which could lead you to other stuff by Ed Brubaker, and don't worry, we'll be coming back to him in a minute. But, if you like those stories and you like Matt Wagner, you could get Mage. Now, Mage is out of print, but fortunately it's still available on Comixology, and I believe everything we're going to talk about is available on Comixology. Mage is an earlier book from Matt Wagner. It's not quite as polished as you're going to get with the Batman stories, but it's also amazing. It's one of the best indie books that's ever come out. It's one of the foundations of the black and white boom of the 80s, which is crazy because color is a very big theme in this. The story is about Kevin Matchstick, he's the guy with the giant lightning bolt on his chest, who's the reincarnation of King Arthur, and he has a magic baseball bat that's his version of Excalibur. I don't want to say anything else because it's going to sound crazy and also give away the plot, but it's a really, really solid, epic story that works really well. So, if you like Matt Wagner, you're going to like Matt Wagner's Mage. It's the Matt Wagnerest book there is. The dude even looks like Matt Wagner. Now, going back to Year 1, and Ed Brubaker. If you want to continue in that Year 1 timeline, you know the way that Year 1 ends with the kind of insinuation that the Joker's going to show up? Well, Batman the Man Who Laughs is a great place to go from there, because it is that story. And like Batman and the Monster Men and Batman and the Mad Monk, it's a retelling of a classic story. It's a retelling of the classic original Joker story that Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson did in Batman #1, where the Joker is sending out death threats and gets past the cops and Batman. It's just done with a modern sensibility by Ed Brubaker and Doug Mahnke. This story was actually redone as The Laughing Fish in the 70s by Steve Englehart and Marshall Rogers, and that's a really good story to track down too. Their run is in the Strange Apparitions paperback, and it's excellent. That story, in turn, was adapted for the Batman the Animated Series episode, The Laughing Fish. So if you've seen that, you know what you're getting into. But this is, honestly, one of the best versions of that story that it's possible to read. And as a bonus, if you get the hardcover version, or the paperback, you also get a cool team-up between Batman and the Golden Age Green Lantern. A lot of Ed Brubaker's run wasn't reprinted, for whatever reason. And it has one of the best stories called The Charlatan. That's in Detective Comics. And if you have read Hush or Long Halloween or Dark Victory because of one of those new readers lists, you really need to find that story. It's available digitally on Comixology, not in print, unfortunately. But it is one of the best Batman villain team-up stories of all time. So if you like those Ed Brubaker stories, Gotham Central. That's a great book. Another one that's often handed to new readers. The reason I would say that you should wait a little bit until you get into it is because of what it represents. You need a solid understanding of Gotham City and how it works before you get into what's really a unique take on Gotham City. This book is about the cops who are basically in competition with Batman for who can bring down the supervillains. Gotham City's kind of Batman's playground. You know, it's his home. So you see Joker killing people. You see Mr. Freeze killing people. You don't really see the collateral damage because it doesn't really matter to Batman himself. You know, somebody dies and Batman avenges their death. That's the end of the story. With this, the people who are often collateral damage take center stage. They're the characters. It's co-written by Ed Brubaker and Greg Rucka. It's got beautiful art by Michael Lark. Brubaker and Lark would also go on to do Daredevil, which is a really, really great run that I can highly recommend. But Gotham Central, if you read it, has the best Joker story ever, Soft Targets. So, again, if you like Batman the Man Who Laughs, get Ed Brubaker and Greg Rucka doing Gotham Central. So let's go all the way back to Batman Year One. Now, it's a very influential book, right? Influenced Batman for the next 30 years. Foundation of what it meant to be the Dark Knight. And that's true, but at the same time, I would argue that it's not the most influential book in terms of Batman. That goes to another Frank Miller and Dave Mazzucchelli book. If you like Batman Year One, you should get Daredevil Born Again. See, this is more or less the book that got those guys the job on Batman. And it's the same kind of thing. Modern 80s urban setting, very crime-ridden, very strangely superhero-y in a lot of ways. There's a guy named Nuke in here who's basically the evil Captain America. It's really, really good stuff, and if you've enjoyed what they did in Batman Year One, then you'll see a lot of the same stuff come up in here. And when you see it come up in here, you'll see it come up again in Daredevil for the next 30 years. Again, very influential work. But when you're done with this one, if you want to go on with reading Daredevil, that's great, because you can read the rest of the Frank Miller run, you can read the Ann Nocenti run, and then you can get to the Brubaker run that I mentioned earlier that has a great story where Daredevil goes to prison with the Kingpin, the Owl, Bullseye, and the Punisher. That's awesome. But that, again, that's really limiting yourself to one character. So you might be wondering if there are other Marvel stories that have this kind of attitude. I would say there are. Kraven's Last Hunt, one of the best Spider-Man stories of the 80s by James Mattias and Mike Zeck. Again, it's very gritty, very dark, very psychological in a lot of ways. It's a very 80s comic in that sort of way, when comics were sort of growing up and trying to be really serious. But it's also really, really good. One of the best Spider-Man stories, one of the best complete Spider-Man stories that you can actually wrap up in a book and sell to people. And again, it's available on Comixology. So, you start with Batman Year One, and you can go to Batman stories, you can go to Mage, you can go to Daredevil, you can go to Kraven's Last Hunt, and from there you can go to Punisher that Mike Zeck drew. There's a lot of different places you can go with it. And once you've read all that, you're not really a new reader anymore. You've got a huge picture of several different eras of Marvel and DC Comics. You've got a bunch of creators that you can watch out for, a bunch of series that you can watch out for, stuff that you can look for in terms of characters that you like. But let's see what happens when we do that with a more modern book. Hawkeye. Everybody likes Hawkeye, right? Hawkeye's great. But the problem with Hawkeye, by Matt Fraction and David Aja, one of the best books going right now, is that it exists in a weird little bubble. Hawkeye the character is in a lot of different books, and, you know, he was in that movie that made $1 billion, so that makes sense. But the feel of Hawkeye doesn't really go into a lot of different Marvel comics. Now, there are a lot of Marvel comics out right now that have that feel that are just now coming out. She-Hulk, Moon Knight, they all take that idea of Hawkeye and sort of bring them to these other characters that really needed a place to shine. And that's great, and they're well worth checking out. But what if you want to find out some older stuff? What if you want a better grounding in the Marvel Universe? Well, the easiest place to go from Hawkeye is to go to Matt Fraction and David Aja's previous work on Immortal Iron Fist. That's a great comic, and it feels a lot like Hawkeye in a lot of ways, in that it's about a blonde, also-ran Marvel character and his weird supporting cast, including a guy named Fat Cobra, who's a giant martial arts master, who was probably the sensational character find of whatever year it was that he came out. So that's a great book, but then you're out of Fraction and David Aja collaborations. There's more Brubaker stuff that you can go to from there, because Brubaker co-wrote that Iron Fist run. So you could go to Captain America, and you'd be doing really well to do so, because again, that's a great run. But what if you want books that have that feel with those characters? Well, here's the recent Power Man and Iron Fist miniseries, The Comedy of Death, that was written by Fred Van Lente, with art by Willington Alves and Perry Perez. This is a really, really fun book. See, Power Man and Iron Fist were a team that dates back to the 70s. It makes sense when you look at them individually. Power Man is the blaxploitation character. Iron Fist is the white guy kung fu master. A friend of mine named Scott says that the biggest missed opportunity in Marvel Comics history was that there was not a show in 1984 on TV called Power Man and Iron Fist that starred Chuck Norris and Mr. T. I think he's right in a lot of ways, because that's what that book was, and I love it. But this is kind of an updating of that. There's a new Power Man who's like a younger kid, but Danny Rand is the same guy that he was in Immortal Iron Fist, the same guy that he was in the original Heroes for Hire series. And they fight these bizarre Marvel villains that, if you like the Tracksuit Mafia, or you like the bad guys that show up in Hawkeye, you're probably going to get a kick out of them. But let's say that what you like about Hawkeye is the focus on an average guy being a superhero. Now, that's been done to death. But I would suggest that if you enjoy that, you might enjoy Starman. It doesn't seem like an easy leap to make, but these are both very visually intriguing books from eras that they were very much out of the norm. Hawkeye doesn't look like an Avengers book. Starman does not look like a DC comic that started in 1994. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. But it has that focus on a younger guy in his 20s having to deal with being a superhero while getting tied up and beaten up a lot. It's actually one of my favorite character pieces, but I will say, it's a bit dated. The first issue of Starman actually has one of my favorite dated references when Jack Knight, the lead character, mentions that Chris Isaac is his definition of the word cool. So take that as you will. Now, Starman deals with a lot of different themes. One of them is legacy. Jack Knight is the son of the original Starman from the Golden Age, who's now kind of forced into taking up the role. So if you like that aspect of Starman, then you'll probably like Mark Waid's run on The Flash. This was one of the cornerstones of DC Comics in the 90s, and it's probably one of the best superhero books of all time. This story in particular, The Return of Barry Allen, is all about the Flash legacy. Barry Allen, of course, being the Silver Age Flash who died in Crisis on Infinite Earths, comes back and kind of shoves Wally West, who was the Flash of the modern era, out of his position. He basically tries to kill him to regain his position, which is a weird thing for a beloved hero to do. Now, there's a twist to the story, because of course there is, but the funny thing about that is that that's actually what happened. Barry Allen is the Flash now, having shoved Wally West into non-existence. But still, it's a great book. Now, let's say that what you like about Hawkeye isn't necessarily the focus on characters. Maybe it's the visuals of the book, because it's a very visually innovative book. There was that issue that was told from the point of view of a dog, where things were done as scents. Now, if you like really visually engaging books that also have really strong character work, then, hey, how'd that get in there? If you like really visually engaging books that also have strong character work, check out Paul Grist's Jack Staff. This is, without question, my favorite superhero series. I know I said Batman Year One was my favorite story, but Jack Staff is my favorite ongoing series. There's a slight distinction there. Paul Grist is amazing. His page layouts are more innovative and more useful in advancing the story than anyone else who has ever worked in comics, and I will stand by that statement. Maybe Kirby, but, you know, Kirby's kind of way up here by this picture of Destro, so he doesn't really count. But Paul Grist is fantastic, and if you like Marvel comics like Hawkeye, then it's worth noting that the stories in this have a lot of Marvel Comics analogs. There's a character that's kind of like Union Jack, obviously. There's a character who's kind of like Captain America. There's a character who's kind of like the Invaders, the Human Torch, the Submariner. There's Tom Tom the Robot Man, who... Tom Tom the Robot Man is great, guys. I don't even want to spoil Tom Tom the Robot Man's deal, because everyone should read this book. So, again, you've got a run of comics that don't all revolve around Hawkeye, but they all revolve around that same feel in one way or another. That's how you make connections to different stuff that you like. Now, Obviously, I worked at a comic book store for a long time. I've been reading comics my entire life, so stuff like that comes pretty naturally to me just because I've read so much of it, and I can say that this is like this. But if you're a new reader, then all you have to do is read them to get to that point. And it's never been easier to read comics than it is right now. Everything I mentioned in that stack is available digitally on Comixology. And I would encourage you, if you like those comics, or if you're an established superhero reader who maybe hasn't checked out one of those, head to Comixology.com and check it out. That does it for this week's episode of Here's the Thing. I know we ran a little long this time, so I don't have time to go with any other starting points, but if you enjoyed this episode and you enjoyed these recommendations, let us know, and maybe I'll do it again. As always, you can hit me up with any viewer questions or any requests for topics to handle on the show at my Twitter, which is twitter.com/THEISB, the ISB. And until then, we'll see you next week with another episode of Here's the Thing. Have a great week, everybody.